An explorer's desk is always cluttered. It's one of those universal constants like destiny or taxes. Those who push back the edges of the map tend never to find enough room in their own worlds for everything they want to do, everything they need to do. And so their workspace, filled with shelves of dark wood and smelling strongly of old books and ink, is always cluttered. Here you'll find pens and paper, books of every sort, a fair collection of glues and knives and paints and all the references that they can gather and call their own. A map is never just ink on a page. It is the vast accumulation of perspective, of experience. Each book is filled with words about those experiences, each map exquisitely rendered with the smell of cool earth and the morning wind. But none of those books or maps, none of the various collections of paper bundles and paints, none of the sketches or the collections of flora will even come close to actually showing the world as it is. Something complete, but small enough to hold a whole world sitting on your desk. Hello adventurers and welcome back to the Red Quills. My name is Ryan, and over the course of this series we've ventured across the surface of the world and out into the far cosmos and beyond. We've talked about maps and atlases throughout history. We've plotted the courses and legends of the stars, even marked the secrets of the planes and ley lines in an attempt to give you some ideas as to how you can map the world and the universe of your fantasy game. And now we come to the crown of this series. Today I've got a special treat for everyone. Not only will I be referencing the maps that I've made up until this point, not only will this episode deal with the practicality and the world building of making a globe of your fantasy world, but this is actually a two-part episode because there's just so much to talk about, and we'll see how that works out. In this episode, I'll talk about the practicalities of building a globe in your fantasy world, the history of globe renders in our own world, and I'll give examples as to how you can pull them into your own world. In the next, I'll show you how I finalized putting it all together and talk about the world building that you can do in an updated summary of the world map tutorials that I've been doing since the start of last year. I've also got some updates on my Fantasy Atlas project along with a map bundle giveaway, so stick around to hear more about that at the end of the episode. Let's get started. Maps are incredible tools for world building. They let us chart new lands, define cultures, and they shape the stories that we tell. But no matter how much detail we put into them, they all have one fundamental limitation. They exist on a flat surface. The world, however, is not flat. It's a sphere. For centuries, cartographers have struggled with the challenges of turning a three-dimensional world into a two-dimensional map, and that's where projections come in. The Mercator projection, which is by far the most well-known and popularized because of international trade and particularly shipping, distorts the size of land masses near the poles and stretches them far beyond their actual proportions. But when you build a globe, you sidestep those distortions entirely. A globe preserves the real relationships between continents, oceans, and trade routes, and it gives the world builder a much clearer sense of scale and geography. So in this episode, I'll be creating a fantasy globe. It's just a test at this point to determine my own world's size and shape, how the continents fit together, and give me a perspective on it that a flat map will never be able to show. And as time goes on, I'll probably make more updated, increasingly detailed, and smoother renditions of this globe so that I can use it properly. But today, we'll look at how globes have been made throughout history, explore some of the techniques for turning a flat map into a sphere, and I'll talk about how this process helps with your world building. And in the next episode, Part 2, which will be available right now for my patrons, will dive deeper into how a globe changes the way we think about fantasy worlds, their geography, their trade, their politics, and their cultures. But first, let's talk about globes and maps in real-world history so that we can figure out how to make one fit into your fantasy world. For as long as people have made maps, they have also tried to represent the world as a sphere. And some of the earliest globes date back over 2,000 years. Ancient Greek scholars like Crates of Malos built models of the Earth as a perfect sphere, divided into quadrants. But these were more philosophical than practical at the time. Most maps were flat, stylized, and based on limited exploration. Alas, none of these early globes have survived, and we only know about them based on second-hand stories. But this only goes to show how significant a globe is in understanding the world around you. Even when you don't know anything about the world, even when one of the only things you know is that it is a globe, someone will make one. You feel it too, don't you? That urge to globe? Despite the fact that none of them have survived, there's no real doubt that they were very inaccurate. Maps were, back then. They were based on hearsay and speculation. That changed during the age of exploration. As sailors charted new coastlines, the need for accurate navigation grew. In the early 1500s, cartographers like Martin Behaim created some of the first modern globes, painted by hand onto delicate paper gores, which are flattened segments designed to wrap around a sphere. Those globes were incredibly detailed for their time, but they still weren't perfect. They were often filled with, shall we say, speculative geography. Blank spaces labelled "Here be dragons," and coastlines that tended to shift with each passing year. Then came Gerard Mercator. In 1569, he introduced the Mercator projection, a way of flattening the world while keeping navigation easy. His map preserved angles and directions, made it useful for sailors, but it stretched land masses near the poles. Greenland, for example, appears much larger than it really is. It was a trade-off. Accuracy in shape and direction at the cost of scale. That trade-off still affects how we see the world today. But a globe doesn't have that problem. Unlike a projection, it represents distances and shapes correctly, making it the most accurate way to visualize a world. And for world building, that's incredibly useful. It forces us to think about how continents connect, where trade routes naturally form, and how cultures develop based on geography. And so in this episode, I'll be making my own fantasy globe. I'll follow some of the historical techniques. First, let's talk about how to actually turn a flat map into a sphere. Turning a flat map into a globe is not as simple as just wrapping paper around a sphere. A map projection distorts the surface, so to make it a proper globe, we need to break it into segments. Historically, cartographers used gores, long, curved strips that, when arranged correctly, fit together without overlapping or stretching too much. And so for this globe, I'll start with a blank sheet of A2 180 GSM watercolor paper that I have pre-weathered, and I'm going to divide that into 12 gores, one for each of the divisions on my flat Mercator map of the world. Each one tapers towards the poles and widens at the equator, keeping distortion to a minimum. If you're making a physical globe, you can either print gores directly onto paper or you can draw them by hand. The key is to keep them evenly spaced. They have to be uniform. And something that I'll warn you about when you're creating your own is that no flat surface will go onto a curved surface without distortion. I want to call myself out here. I hand-painted and hand-cut these gores, measured them based on some rudimentary mathematics. But I made some errors, which I'll tell you about, so you don't make them yourself. One of the decisions that I made was to cut the gores before drawing out the map, and then draw the map before placing it onto the globe. Now, I did this for specific reasons. The first, because the gores would help me to combat the distortion of the map when drawing it out. And the second, because the curved surface of the globe would be difficult to draw on and would lower the quality of the illustration. If I were to do it again, I would still do both. And it's important to remember that there will always be distortion issues. No matter how small a piece of paper you use, no matter how thin the gauze, the distortion will still be there because it's a flat surface on a curved sphere. If you're making your own globe, don't aim for a method which will eliminate error, because the exactitude that you will need for a project like this relies both on your measurements and on your execution, and there's too much that can go wrong either way when doing things by hand, which means that you don't want a method that will eliminate errors. You want a method that will allow you to address them. The one that I saw after the fact is of, for instance, deliberately leaving 1 mm gaps between the gauze of the sphere as a stylistic choice, so they look more purposeful, and it will allow you to control for errors of up to 1 mm, which is all you really need. The errors that I have on this map are only up to about 1 mm in either direction. Controlling for that will allow you to make the sphere look as if it's perfect, without needing to go into an exactitude that's physically impractical. If you don't want to do that, make sure that you keep the join flat on the equator, and then if there are any gaps between gores, have specific thin strips ready to glue between them. I'll probably go for the stylized look for the next one myself. And the base for the globe can be anything. A foam ball, a wooden sphere, even a 3D printed shell. Historically, globes were made with paper mache over a wooden core and then covered with the gores. I'll be using the modern approach, which is to buy a globe and then put my map on top of it. And this tutorial does teach you the enviable knowledge of how to make a globe using only a globe. The gores will need to be carefully cut out, lined up, and then adhered without too many wrinkles or gaps. If you want to make them digitally, you can, but this is a tutorial for doing it practically. When making the gores, I started by weathering them, and then after that was done, I used pencil to sketch out, using the Mercator map I'd already created, the rough outline of the coasts, lining the gores up using the curved edges to allow for the distortions. I put the general location of names, and then I used watercolor paints, followed by fineliner pens, to show the coastlines, the mountains, and then the labels. Finally, because I wanted it to be eye-catching, I used a gold pen for the labels and the coastlines of the continents, so that it would really catch the eye when looking at it. Overall, I wanted something that wasn't going to be too colorful, but did give the impression of being a fairly ostentatious globe. Something that caught the eye, that shined a little bit. The process took quite a long time. It's not as simple as making a flat map. In fact, it's more like making two. On the one hand, you need to create the flat map on the gores, and on the second, you really need to spend the same amount of time you'd put into making a normal map into just gluing it onto the sphere, which takes a great deal of time. I used Mod Podge to glue the gores onto the sphere itself, of which I have a great deal lying around for my own crafting reasons. Generally, it comes clear, but mine is brown, which I thought would add to a feeling of a stained old globe. The issue with my using the watercolors and the fineliner inks on the globe is that one of my ideas that I would pitch to anyone who wants to try it for themselves using a non-water-based, non-porous ink is that you could use something like a gloss Mod Podge, a shining varnish, to smooth out any irregularities that you have as the paper dries. This will stop any ripples in the edges of the gores, and it'll make the world look more put together, smoother. Unfortunately, I can't do that. On my test pieces, it showed that the paint and the labels would both run, and I didn't want that on my map. But it's worth noting for future uses. And so that, really quite simply, is how I put the globe together. It's a much shorter explanation than it is in practice, and both this video and the one following will show the actual process of putting it together. If you want to see how it works, keep watching. But that is the step-by-step. So how would you use this in your own worlds? How would you bring it into your fantasy campaign? What excuse do you need to make one of your own? Let's talk about what that looks like. Let's talk about why a globe exists in a fantasy world. When you make a globe, you shift your perspective. You make your world more real. When we rely on flat maps, we unconsciously accept distortions. Borders stretch, continents warp, distances get skewed. But when you hold a globe in your hands, you see the world as it truly is, continuous, interconnected, and without edges. The process isn't just useful for map makers. If you're a world builder, a globe forces you to think about how your world fits together. How do trade routes really function when you account for curvature? What happens to climates when you stop thinking in rectangles? Where do explorers go when there's no true edge of the map? And I'll give you a sneak peek of the end of next episode so you can see the globe assembled. And when you do have that, it's time to explore what it means for world building. So in the next episode, I'll take this sphere and examine how it changes the way we think about geography, politics, and storytelling. I'll also revisit some of my previous world-building videos on trade, on cultural icons, ley lines, vanishing continents to see how they can apply when viewed on a globe. And the beauty of globes is how they challenge our assumptions. A world that seemed balanced on paper might be wildly different when wrapped around a sphere. Continents shift. Oceans stretch, and places that once felt distant might suddenly be much closer than you thought. It's an invitation to rethink your world, not just its physical form, but how people navigate it, trade across it, and tell stories within it. If this has sparked new ideas for your own maps, I've got more coming soon. In this episode, as I mentioned, I'm going to take this globe and explore what it means for world building. I'm preparing some big updates for the Fantasy Atlas project soon as well, and the map bundle giveaway is also ongoing. I'm starting a new mailing list for the Red Quills. I want to include a weekly tip or challenge for map making and world building, as well as the blog posts that accompany these YouTube videos, so that it's all together in one place. If you put your name into the running, you'll be in the draw to win the bundle of maps, which includes 3 full-sized maps of the world of Arreia, which you can use for your own campaign or in tandem with the Atlas of Endon as I continue to update it. So if you want to be in the draw for that free collection of high-resolution fantasy maps, make sure that you're signed up for the mailing list. The link is in the description below. You can also find digital downloads of my maps on Patreon, along with the extra resources and behind-the-scenes content. And as a thanks for everyone who does support me on Patreon, and because it was specifically requested of me to do something like this, the second part of this topic, the next episode, is already available for my paid patrons. If you want to watch it desperately, you can head on over to my Patreon, the link also in the description below, and you can check it out over there. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe for more fantasy map making content. I'll see you in the next one, and until then, happy mapping.